Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am your host, Tylor, who signs on every week and says exactly the same thing. And guess what? I'm going to do it again. I really like these books, and I am excited for what we got this week, even though, admittedly, it kind of felt like a chapter where we caught up with a lot of people and then introduced like one or two new characters and immediately ended. It didn't feel like a monumental chapter in any way, despite it being long enough for it to justify being its own chapter. So I am, of course, joined by Greg, who doesn't know much about this series and thus can't get the enjoyment that I mostly got out of it, which was going, hey, I know those names. Greg, how do you feel about these chapters?
Just one chapter, of course, and we are referring to chapter 8, The Storm Gathers in the Lord... Oh, no, in Lord of Chaos. That's going to trip me up every time. And yeah, I think I largely agree with you. This felt to me like almost like a prologue in some ways, right? It's just kind of, hey, well, who's around? What's going on? Okay, we'll just kind of check in. I think a lot of films use a scene like that where like the cool guy walks through high school and like checks in with all the characters that will become important later in the movie, and that's what this kind of felt like. And hey, Nynaeve's a cool guy at school, I guess is what I'm saying.
I am just imagining Nynaeve taking a role in like She's All That, and I am loving this visual image. Yeah, I thought this was an interesting week in that it somehow felt like it was the fallout from the previous chapter in a lot of ways, and then that wasn't actually what was interesting about it at all. That was kind of the motivating force behind a lot of what we got, but at the end of the day, I was kind of like, you know what's exciting here? Nynaeve as a character and not much else. What was your kind of takeaway before I say, hey, let's summarize this chapter, and then the details are hopefully where we get to dive in a little bit?
Yeah, I think I would say that this felt like it really wanted to demonstrate that this Salidar community is not as isolated as they maybe felt, right? And maybe that part of that is how much it has grown since we were previously here in the last book, and we've gotten hints at that before, but it's like, oh, this is a real town and there's lots of people and there's lots of comings and goings, and then the big hint that it's not that secret anymore, really, especially to the White Tower. I don't think I should call that a hint. I think they just said that plainly. It's not a secret to the White Tower anymore. So all of that felt really important. But I think part of why it felt like a prologue to me is again, I mean, in my book, we just cruised past page 250, and I still feel like we're in preamble territory, even though that's now just about exactly a quarter of the book done.
Yeah, we are at 7 out of 28 weeks, and so it definitely feels like we should be kind of moving. I think some of this is the challenge of that giant prologue, right? When your prologue is almost 100 pages long, reaching 250 isn't actually quite as monumental as it feels, given how much of that time was just pure setup. Given that, I think it's time for me to do our podcast version of pure setup. Let's summarize Chapter 8, The Storm Gathers. Nynaeve wakes up grumpy, surprise, surprise, after a night in which she wasted, mostly looking for Lyanna and not being able to find her. Nynaeve wears the Adam bracelet for fear that Lelaine won't, because she tends to leave it simply attached on the hook, and Lelaine tells of the night's events, and Nynaeve says that she saw Rand, possibly in Teleron Riode in the flesh, or at least someone who looked like him. Nynaeve is unable to get Merrigan away from her chores, and so she needs to make her way through the village to find some way to busy herself. The village is quite bustling, and Nynaeve wants to avoid the attention of any Aes Sedai because that typically means chores. Nynaeve worries about Lan avenging Moraine, and she admits to herself that she was happy when Moraine died, but she also realizes how selfish that was, and she feels bad about it. She sees Loghain being guarded by a sister and several warders, and being interrogated by a couple of them. Most notably, Lelaine is there, who is a sitter for the Blue Aja. Loghain is telling her about the Red Sisters who helped him, which we know is something that he has been coached to say by Siwan, and one of the Aes Sedai at the table is doubtful, but Lelaine says that she has heard it and had it confirmed by someone who cannot lie. Loghain says that the Reds helped him to avoid other Aes Sedai for nearly a year before they eventually turned him in to basically get the benefits of having captured a false dragon, and Nynaeve thinks that he would do anything to hurt the Red Aja at this point. When Loghain comments on the motivations of the Reds, Lelaine stops him, saying that he no longer seeks glory and so he doesn't need to prove himself, and Nynaeve is able to get away before being given any chores, which seems to be her main goal. Nynaeve immediately runs into Siwan and Brine, arguing about the shirts that she has poorly laundered, and she refuses to report the goings-on with him about anything that is happening in the tower. She seems to not basically be willing to be a spy for him. Eventually, Nynaeve gets Siwan to help with studying stilling, and Siwan commits to doing that evening. Nynaeve tries to find out about what is going on with the Hall and why they are delaying so much and what their plans are for Rand, but as Siwan seems about to potentially say something, first Lyanna arrives, unable to get them, who is apparently unable to get them into the meeting with the Wise Ones, and then Lelaine shows up, causing Siwan and Lyanna to immediately start bickering because they need to keep up their appearances in front of Aes Sedai. Lelaine asks Nynaeve what she thinks Rand will do next, and she gives a fairly non-committal answer, and then Lelaine asks after Egwene, Mat, and Perrin. Lelaine says that everyone tries to encourage Nynaeve to give up on healing stilling because she thinks it is wasted effort, and Nynaeve then says that Sheriam gave her permission, and Lelaine basically laughs this off as something she'll get over eventually. Lelaine mentions Nynaeve cutting her hair and then departs. Nynaeve seems disappointed in the Yellows, who haven't been supporting her studies in Saladar, and she observes a newly arrived Aes Sedai who seems to be from somewhere else, and then she sees Uno and starts thinking that Uno continues to offer them ways to get out of town and flee, but currently Tom and Julin are away, and so even though Nynaeve is currently inclined to try to get away from Saladar, now is not the moment. Nynaeve then watches Elaine teaching a number of novices, and she thinks that she is angry enough to see the flows, and many of the new novices are individuals who have been recruited in ways that would not have been acceptable in the old tower, but those recruitments have been successful, so they continue. Nynaeve then encounters Theodrin, the person who is not quite an Aes Sedai, but has been promoted above being an accepted, and Theodrin tells her of her block that prevented her from using the tower, how she used to only be able to channel around men, and then she eventually broke her block using the twin of a man who she thought that she was channeling around, who was actually a woman. Theodrin then says that she plans to break Nynaeve's block no matter how difficult it will be, and when Nynaeve says that she cannot train to break her block that night, Theodrin says that she will every night afterwards, and at this point Nynaeve is extra angry, and she thinks that her weather sense is also off because it feels like it should be hailing right now. At this point, Moghedien, aka Merrigan, arrives, upset that her hands have been destroyed by washing dishes, and Nynaeve is extremely curt, reminding her that she, has a death sentence hanging over her head. Nynaeve asks Moghedien to show her how to detect a man's channeling, and it is an extremely complex weave that she tries over and over again, but all she succeeds in doing is giving herself a headache. Nynaeve thinks on Theodrin while failing to do this weave, and then Elaine arrives with news of an ambassador from the tower. No one knows what to make of it, even though it seems like everyone is talking about it, and Nynaeve worries that the rebel Aes Sedai will go back to the tower, and then Nynaeve seems to be thinking that it should be hailing as the chapter ends, and she is even more frustrated than she woke up, which is saying something, because Nynaeve waking up on the wrong side of the bed is terrifying. Greg, this was a chapter that I really kind of enjoyed as like a slice of life in Saladar, and to give us a feel for where Nynaeve is at after so many resets in her storyline, but I didn't really feel grabbed by any of the plot as we kind of discussed before we started this. Did you have that same feeling of really kind of enjoying Nynaeve more than I have in a while, or did this kind of feel very much like a wasted chapter?
Oh, I wouldn't go that far. There were no dreams, so it couldn't have been wasted. So I think
my video was off, but I almost spit out my water when you said that.
I would say that I think I also enjoyed kind of checking in on Nynaeve, and the ongoing plotline we've talked about particularly from the end of the last book is that she was just so beaten down. And so I found myself kind of trying to unravel exactly where Nynaeve was, and you rightfully in your summary pointed out the frustration. But a lot of that doesn't seem like global frustration. It's like day-to-day frustration. It's like having a bad day doesn't necessarily mean you're depressed or in a bad headspace. So I think I felt overall, and I'm going to ask you to tell me where you think she's at, but I think I felt more than anything that Nynaeve was feeling a little lost, right? Yeah. There's this kind of big web of relationships. It's telling to me how many teaching relationships are present here, things she's supposed to teach people, things she's supposed to learn from people, and then the level on top of that of things she's supposed to do, but things she's hiding that she's supposed to do, and things that she's supposed to do that she should not be hiding, and so on. And so that kind of layer of deception plus all those commitments just feels, and then her desire to be like, maybe I should just give it all up, really felt like, to me, she doesn't have a clear direction. Yeah. And there's maybe one candidate for what she would do if she was kind of totally on her own, but she's just so enmeshed in all of this. You know, the repeated kind of refrains of like, you've been missing our meetings or you've been dodging these meetings and things like that show that like there's all this busyness and yet it's not getting done or it's not moving forward. So I agree that to me all just sums up to like, yeah, the plots aren't moving forward because they're all too busy.
Yeah, and I think the way that I would describe this is in the previous few books, Nynaeve in the big picture has been really successful and things have been going her way, right? She defeated a Forsaken multiple times. She recovered the sad bracelets from Tanchico. She got away from all of the problems. Things were going great, but at kind of the micro level, at her individual personal relationships, everything was terrible, right? Her and Egwene's relationship really was not going the way she wanted. She was really frustrated with a lot of the interactions in the circus. Like, it felt like big picture things were great and little picture everything was falling apart last book. And it feels like Nynaeve in this chapter is the exact opposite of that. She is succeeding as an accepted. She does not have any, like, big existential threats. Lan not being around is sad, but she's kind of accomplishing her main goals. But then this chapter is very much every little interaction she has does not go the way she wants it to. And I think that's almost harder to deal with for a character like Nynaeve, right? It's one thing to be really beaten down interpersonally, but at least your life is going right. It's a little bit harder to be like, I feel like everything is going fine, but then every individual piece of my life is terrible. That's not a fun place to be, and I feel like this is a chapter of her getting little beatdowns in ways that she can't actually vent about to anyone because they're so small, but that stuff adds up.
Yeah, I mean, listeners may not know this, but Tylor is just sneaking in a reference to my hip-hop persona, which is Lil Beatdown. And I think that feels exactly right to me, right? And I was trying to relate it to the real world, and the kind of easiest way is like your personal like job life, right? Like, you know, I certainly have some weeks where I feel like I'm great at my job and I'm doing everything right, and then I come home and my kids just scream at me and yell at me. And then I have the opposite, which is everything seems great at home, and then everybody at work's like, what are you doing? And it often comes down to like your focus, right? I guess I'm Star Warsing. Your focus determines the reality. But like where you're putting your energy and effort often kind of dictates some of that. So I guess my question in response to what you're saying, while calling me Lil Beatdown, is that I feel like I'm not sure if Nynaeve has neglected these personal relationships so they feel so wrong, or that she's starting to value them more, so she's starting to neglect the professional life. I don't know if that's the right reading of this, but it kind of feels like it's related.
I think you're hitting this nail on the head, and also identifying that I think that this is a fascinating chapter because I am currently living a fantastic life and am also unemployed. And that's basically what we're describing here, is like everything is going good except, and I think that somehow cuts harder sometimes, especially if you're Nynaeve, who is kind of getting all of her little flaws pointed out by different people in a variety of places throughout this chapter. So I think that's a good place to then say, let's figure out what are all of these little kind of pricks, because if we're saying at the end of the last book, it felt like,
wait, your hip hop name was Lil Prick. That's so
correct,
funny.
yeah.
You got both.
Nice work. The beginning of this chapter is Nynaeve is frustrated because she spent her entire night wasting her time doing nothing, and then she wakes up to her, let's be honest, prettier, more interesting friend telling her how fascinating her night was, and she got to help all of their mentors in a way that might make her relationship with them better. Like, I completely understand why this, if this was a movie where Nynaeve lived this day over and over, this would be the worst part of her day every morning.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that it's hard to wake up next to the queen of the realm, right? Or the future queen of the realm. And it does feel when are we recording? Is Wicked still relevant? It feels very much like Wicked, right? It's a little bit of the Glinda Elphaba, right? Like Nynaeve might have the real talent in some ways, but is never going to live that kind of sweet cherry life that Glinda gets to.
I need you to stop looking at my Hulu watch list right before we go on air. That's not okay. I actually really liked the moment that immediately followed this, where Nynaeve leaves the room and is kind of thinking about, like, what does Rand need? What is Lelaine frustrated about? And then that almost, you can see the runaway train of thought that leads her to Lan and Moraine and her kind of feelings around that. And so I want your thoughts both on how do you think that Nynaeve is dealing with, as you said, kind of living in the shadow of Lelaine, it feels like a little bit, and inadvertently in the shadow of Moghedien, right? She's getting all of the praise for the things that Moghedien is doing. And at the same time, as you said, if there was one thing she could kind of want to do, it would probably be resolve this land situation, and she can't, right? So it feels like that tension is really what's driving the early part of this chapter. What are your thoughts on that kind of, like, those two driving forces of Nynaeve?
Well, I think the symbol that Robert Jordan gives us in pure Robert Jordan fashion is Lan's heavy ring hanging between her breasts, because he wants to make sure you picture that. And I think that to me is, again, it's a heavy ring. It's an anchor. It's pulling her down. It's preventing her from, and we can't pretend I've had a lot of dating experience, but it feels to me like when, somebody can tell the relationship is probably over, but doesn't get that finality, so there's still enough hope that she's still got this, like, glimmer of, like, what I really want is to run away and go be happy forever with Lan, but is so stuck on the fact that he can't do that, but maybe he can, and so, yeah, she's just pulled down by that weight.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, right? To think of Nynaeve as someone who has so many things she wants to do, but is constantly kind of being bound down by the things she needs to do them, right? She is constantly, I wish I could be with Lan, but I need to be an Aes Sedai, and I wish I could feel these things, but I need to build relationships with the Yellows. And I think that kind of just needing to do step A before step F is really kind of wearing on her in this chapter. And then we get this really interesting scene of Loghain, as far as I can tell, just completely lying his ass off. And the Aes Sedai being like, oh, well, someone who can't lie told me it was true. And I'm left really wondering whether that someone who can lie is someone who can't lie is Siwan, who can lie.
Yeah, that seemed like the natural interpretation to me, right? And the way it was said is also not a lie, right? Like someone who can't lie said that to me, and even if that person knew that Suan could lie, you can, I guess it wasn't like somebody who took a vow not to lie told me that, but it essentially felt like that.
And then I felt the follow-up to that, where Lelaine is kind of talking about Loghain after he gives this description, and I think Robert Jordan probably intentionally has her use the same word that's from Min's vision. She says he no longer seeks glory. And every person who remembers Min's vision, immediately there's like a flashing red light that's like, no, the Aes Sedai are wrong about this. And I think this is something Robert Jordan's done many times before. He's had like someone who is supposed to be an authority figure just say something that we as readers know is flat out wrong to kind of get us questioning who is saying what and why. I think Pedron Nial, the leader of the White Cloaks, constantly being wrong about Rand is our best example of that so far. But it felt like a good example here that so many of the things we hear in this series are kind of built on like secondhand knowledge, and I this makes me really worry about what have we heard in the past that isn't true, and what kind of is the fallout from, for example, Lelaine thinking that the Red Aja did these things. How does that 5 books from now ripple effect and cause problems?
And forgive me for asking the dumb question. I need to ask. Just remind us, Lelaine she's just a powerful Aes Sedai. She's not to be seen as like the Amerlin seat because they haven't elected one. But is she at like the highest tier here?
Exactly. So I think this is actually our first introduction to Lelaine as a named character. Maybe she has been like in the background of scenes before, but as the dominant speaking force, I think this is the first time we've really had her in a scene. She is identified as a sitter for the Blue Aja, so we know each Aja has 3 sitters, and so in Saladar there would be 18 sitters. Normally there would be 21 with 7 Ajas, but there's no Reds. So she is kind of one of the 18 highest ranking in the area. Lelaine is a good name to have in your head. I will say to experienced readers who see Lelaine, I rolled my eyes. I don't know if everyone did. But it's a good name to have in your head. She is a high-ranking Blue Aja Aes Sedai. Unless you have anything else to say about Loghain, I actually thought that there was a Lelaine moment that is very helpful for identifying who she is. After the meeting with Loghain, Nynaeve steps outside. Lelaine talks to her. This is a little bit after. We'll come back to the Suan stuff. But Lelaine seems very frustrated by Nynaeve's kind of impertinence and willingness to question her commands, and Lelaine seems to have picked up on the fact that when Nynaeve is being obstinate, she pulls her braid. Lelaine's response to that, why don't you cut all your hair off? And I think that tells you everything you need to know about who Lelaine is as a problem solver and character going forward. She's the person who would cut the rope in order to get rid of the knot.
That's helpful, certainly. And thinking of her as potentially a powerful member of the ruling council, or also right to see her as a candidate for Amerlin seat, perhaps. Absolutely. Right? Because any sitter, I assume, is kind of at the level. I assume anybody could be named Amerlin seat, but you have to have that kind of level of notoriety to have a shot.
I think the only details that we have gotten so far is we know that Suan got the Amerlin seat through significant politicking, and we know that it is voted on, and typically, if not unanimous, it at least needs to be like some sort of high majority to become the Amerlin seat. So, yeah, you'd need to be someone who could kind of build a coalition in order to have that happen, and a high-ranking member of the Blues feels like a very reasonable person to have that.
Okay, helpful.
Awesome. So from there, let's actually step back a tiny bit. Suan and Gareth Brine are arguing about the laundry again. I don't know whether you care at all, but that's kind of what we got for those two characters.
I mean, I think that's the moment Suan yells something about fish, like, oh, fish guts. Maybe that's a little later. But I was like, oh, come on with the fish.
Let's
like, we need more.
She yells, oh, fish guts 5 times in this chapter.
Oh, okay.
I have remembered all of them, but I'm just assuming that is true.
Yeah. And so it feels to me like they have something going, and then my question always becomes, do I know what that thing is and I should be recalling that connection, or do I just not know what it is quite yet? So I'll let you fill in that detail.
The answer to your question is both. So as a quick reminder, Gareth Bryan and Siwan, she was one of the people who burned down the barn, and Gareth Bryan sentenced them to like 25 years in his manor, and then they ran away, and then he caught up with them, and he remembered Siwan's eyes, and so he insists that they continue working for him, even though all he really cares about is Siwan. That's the stuff that I think is pretty like top of mind. The other thing that I want to throw in there is remember that Min had a vision of the two of them, that if they stayed together, they would both live, and if they were separate for too long, they would both die. So there is both, as you're saying, kind of the like friends to lovers, will they, won't they thing of them clearly like having eyes for each other, even though they're a master and servant, which is weird. But also, there's this kind of like prophecy, and the kind of fate seems to be binding them together. So with that context, the shirts are not clean enough, Greg. It's very upsetting.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the best response, honestly. I really liked the moment after that. So Siwan talks to Nynaeve. I don't care about that at all. But then Lyanna shows up, and they immediately start talking about, like, are we going to be able to join in on the meeting in Teleron Riod? Nynaeve wants to know what are their plans for the new Merlin, and why is everyone dragging their feet, and why haven't decisions been made? And that is literally all we get until Lelaine shows up, and they have to scatter like fighting cats. But I thought the, like, maybe a half a page of intricate detail and plotting and then immediately cattiness really sold how well Siwan and Lyanna have done at kind of making it clear to everyone other than Nynaeve and Elaine that they are not getting along. And it's kind of fun to see because we've heard about it so much, but we've always seen those two characters from either Elaine or Nynaeve's perspective, and so they're not play acting in front of them.
Yeah, I think it's a fun little bit to keep track of, because it, like you're saying, we're getting these various perspectives on it and seeing it kind of build over time. I think my struggle here is really trying to figure out Siwan. I feel like I have just enough pieces to be curious about all the things she's up to, and I find myself rooting for her to be able to kind of take back control of the Aes Sedai, essentially. But I don't know that I yet see a path for that to be possible. Even though they've put into play getting the powers back, having some political clout, like those pieces are all there, but it doesn't seem quite possible yet.
Well, and this is one of those fun things that I think Robert Jordan does, is he really enjoys giving us like 12 pieces of a 100-piece puzzle and just like winking at us like all the pieces are green. You can figure this out. And I think that's kind of what's going on here, is we've gotten so many hints about like there is the sitters in Saladar, but there's also this weird group of Sheriums that seems to be running things. And it seems like Siwan and Lyanna are pushing for something that involves Loghain's scheme, but also involves manipulating the sitters, but also involves being seen as separate from each other. In the previous book, I think there were hints about them talking about like who would be in charge and whether they should be from the tower or whether they should have been out of the tower at the time and whether they should be powerful. So there's just enough details to be tantalizing, but not enough that I think you can figure it out. This feels like the really frustrating moment towards the end of every like Agatha Christie story where you're not sure you could actually solve this mystery yourself. You kind of feel like you're missing the one critical clue. That's where I feel like we're sitting with Siwan and Lyanna.
But they treat you as if you could have, right? So that the reveal is then like, you didn't catch this, even though there's probably that one piece that's impossible. Yeah,
and
good
that's exactly my job on this podcast, is after the reveal to be like, you didn't get that? Please, I got that on my third read through. There is this kind of really interesting quick moment that I want to throw in. Everyone, that is Siwan and Lelaine and I think even Lyanna very briefly, all want to know what Nynaeve thinks Rand is going to do and what Rand kind of needs at this moment. Seems to be very much at the top of their mind. And so I'm curious your thoughts on that dynamic. It seems like everyone in Saladar is really keyed in on how do we build this alliance with Rand, but none of them are actually doing anything about it. And maybe that's the same mystery we were just describing of why aren't things happening, but that felt kind of like the subtext of a lot of scenes in this chapter.
Yes, I thought, what stood out to me is how many references there are to, like, you're from the same village as him, and so is that other girl. Like, it's like they all just figured out the Ta'Viren thing for the first time, right? Yeah. Like, that, like, oh, wow, that's kind of crazy that you're all from the same place. So it felt like to me that what's being hinted at is that the conflict between the two factions of Aes Sedai is going to come down to which one gets into Rand's good graces, right? That Rand is, among the other things Rand is a pawn for this conflict, and they both sides want to kind of get control of him or get him to tip the scales in their favor. And so it felt like all those people who wield some power in this community are desperate to get any little, scrap of insight so that they can win that conflict to come.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly it. Is there's something really interesting about watching this group that is ostensibly kind of defining itself as the pro-Dragon Reborn camp, given that the other group just has the Red Aja, and thus they feel like they have an advantage in that. And yet their strategy for doing so seems to be to send an embassy and ask Nynaeve a lot what they should be doing. And it feels really passive in the same way that they're being criticized for not choosing in a Merlin and a lot of other things. And it kind of makes me wonder what's going on behind the scenes that's creating that slowdown. I don't have anything else about that politics. I thought it was really fascinating that Nynaeve actually comes down on the side of I would run away today if Tom and Julian weren't out of town. I don't know whether that is her just being so frustrated with the 8 things that have gone wrong prior to this, or whether that's kind of a real feeling. What is your thought on that? There's almost like a 2-page I could run away if I want to before we get back to the main chapter. What was your takeaway from that? Or are you thinking that is actually where the plot is going, or is this kind of setting up her constantly saying, no, I can't leave?
I mean, we all have those days at work. Like, what if I just ran off? What if I became a fisherman and didn't do any of this anymore?
You just got back from a vacation. It is your job on vacation to once a day go, yeah, I could live in London.
It's a really interesting dynamic, which is what I always say to fill just a little bit of time. What comes to mind primarily is that I think it's telling that there's some part of her pulling her away. And it feels to me like how Perrin went home and that Matt is trying to get away, seemingly towards home. But again, neither Matt nor Nynaeve have said, like, I need to go back to the Two Rivers. Yeah. But it does feel like there's a pull in that direction, like away. And I'm not even sure I could cite any evidence were I to. But this idea of, I think this is a classic hero trope, which is, in the Joseph Campbell cycle, it's called the refusal of the call. It's like, what if I just pretend my destiny does not exist out there? And I think, Rand kind of had to accept his early on, but these side characters are still like, am I sure I need to be a part of this grand, big tapestry, or might it be that I could really just run away and hide from all of these things?
For the record, I know I'm not a hero because I've been refusing the call for about 30 years.
Well, and, I think it's an old Simpsons reference. My grad school friends and I used to talk about a lot. I think Homer Simpson says when the going gets tough, he likes to build a pile of coats on his bed and hide underneath it until everything works out, which I don't think he ever does, but it's just like a good throwaway gag. And so
I am just assuming that Conan O'Brien wrote that. That just sounds like him.
So it just feels to me like we all have that impulse. My grad school friends and I would say that, like, I could do this term paper, or I could build a pile of coats and just hide under it until everything's okay. And so I think that never feels like a real possibility to me. I mean, Matt's is always like, I'm going to retire next week kind of feeling too, like those tropes. And I don't think any of these characters can escape the web of destiny here.
Yeah, I think that's a good call, right? There's something really interesting about how many kind of ties between all of these Two Rivers folk we're getting, and then at the same time, none of them, sans Perrin, are going back to the Two Rivers, and Perrin is going back to completely change the Two Rivers, right? There's something really fun about all these characters longing for something that we know is not going to be there when they get back. The last thing we've got in this chapter, then, is the introduction of our second character who we need to remember their name. Lelaine is a Blue Aja sitter who seems like she might be important, and Theodrin is almost an Aes Sedai, and actually gets what I thought was a really interesting introduction here, right? She is very clearly going to be tied up with Nynaeve's inability to channel without being angry, and her origin story is she used to have a very similar block that actually seems much more inconvenient than the anger thing, and she got over it using kind of a fun trick. And it makes me wonder, what is this going to look like now for Nynaeve to try to break the block, where it seems like they almost want to trick her into thinking she's angry when she's not angry?
Yeah, so it kind of reminded me, I haven't gotten a Harry Potter reference in this week. In Harry Potter, when you suddenly get to the 7th book and they're like, here are some complicated wand politics that will be the unlocking of the final battle for you. And it felt like that. Like, here's a whole dynamic you haven't heard of. And kind of similarly, it's like, the block is almost sentient, but it's foolishly sentient so that you can trick it with something silly. The other idea that comes to mind is you hear these stories about like a war veteran who loses a hand like with a grenade, but the muscles were clenched, and like how they can use mirrors and kind of VR or something to trick them to release the muscles that aren't actually there anymore, and their pain goes away. Maybe that's a real thing, or maybe that was just an episode of House. I'm not entirely sure at this point. But so it feels like that kind of thing. Like, if the block is purely psychological, then we can find weird tricks to get around it. But it feels like it's psychological with just a little bit of like, haha, the power makes it actually kind of real.
I think that's right. There's something kind of fun about this in the sense that I want to find out how this process works after hearing Theodrin's story, right? It makes me go, there are rules here, it makes sense, but they're kind of funny rules. And so I want to see what the edge cases are and whether Nynaeve is odd enough that kind of the traditional ways of approaching this don't work. That sounds like a fun little plot line for us to pursue over the next, knowing Robert Jordan, 900, 1,000 pages. Any last thoughts on Theodrin before we get to kind of the final moment of the chapter, which is, hey, it turns out the White Tower knows where you are and they want to talk?
That's the exciting moment for me, right? Like, if you had asked me to do the summary, I would have skipped right to that. So I'm skipping right to that. We'll remember Theodrin. Maybe we'll ask you who she is when that name comes up again.
Don't put a we on that. One of us will remember Theodrin.
I thought this was really curious because I would say this is something I thought would come much, much later. I assume that this is a message of war or a come heal to us message that will be delivered. But very surprising that this kind of underground resistance plotline I've been planning in my head may already have its kind of existence blown.
Well, and I think this is a very interesting moment, right? Is it has not been clear that the White Tower is unaware of Saladar, right? We know from letters and such that they know where it is, but there's something very different about knowing that something exists and acknowledging its existence directly, right? Like, this happens all the time in politics where, like, everyone knows that we know that they know that we know, but we can't say that we know that we know that they know that we know. I mean, this is the Israeli nuclear program is exactly what we are describing here, right? Like, we know it exists, but we can't say it exists. And I think that there's something, it's a really fascinating thing to now ask, what is behind the decision to send the embassy now, right? Is this Elida thinking that she holds all the cards because her embassy is going to win over Rand, and so she is going to be able to get them on her side immediately? Is she thinking, like, this is a desperate thing for Elida? She knows that Rand is going to side with Saladar, and so she's in trouble. It feels like there are a lot of motivations we can read into this, even more so because we know that at the end of the last book, Rand got 2 letters from the White Tower, one from Elida and one from Elviarin. And so there's a lot of questions in my mind about, like, what is the goal of this embassy and who actually sent it? And those are kind of lingering, interesting questions to my mind. So what do you expect from this? As you said, earlier than you expected plot line. Do you think this is something that blows up quickly, or do you see this being like the whole book is about the negotiations around this embassy?
I think it blows up quickly. I mean, my only hesitation in saying that is that these places are kind of far apart, but, you know, it seems like this is the conflict. And this goes back to saying who will get Rand on their side. Like, it seems like this is being set up as that the kind of focus of this book. And again, with probably Rand being Lord of Chaos, but maybe not Rand being Lord of Chaos, it feels like that would kind of make sense, as in, like, who controls the Lord of Chaos controls the game or something like that, right? Almost sounds like tarot cards or something. So I think this is going to go ahead pretty quickly, although I will say I looked at the next chapter and was disappointed to see we're not going to get an explanation exactly of what the embassy is right away. It doesn't appear.
Yeah, this is one of the interesting things about this book is we are now kind of entering into a slightly different rhythm than we have before. I think we've kind of been used to getting 2 or 3 weeks in a row with a single POV, and now it's very clear that that is not the case, at least early on in this book. I think 2 chapters is the longest we've stuck with any one character so far, and that continues. We are jumping around quite a bit. Next week, we are finally back to doing 2 chapters a week instead of 1, so we will be covering Chapter 9, Plans, and Chapter 10, A Saying in the Borderlands. Do note this is within our normal range for a week, but it's right on the kind of high end of that range. So if you're someone who sometimes needs a little extra time to get the reading done, plan an extra night, or, you know, an extra late night to finish these chapters. It probably will be a bit longer than typically. We get some fun stuff coming up. I have to say, I'm used to saying, like, oh, it's week 8, not a whole lot's going to happen, ho-hum. I can actually preview something important will happen, even though it's only week 8. Greg, do you think I'm lying?
No, I thought you were going to say the name of the podcast. No, that's exciting, and it is exciting times, as we've alluded to. If you are not watching the Wheel of Time TV show, watch it. Get everybody who's your friend to watch it. I
believe the finale will be airing around the same time as this episode.
So make sure you do that. And then I will just throw in my occasional plug. So we are also just about on Andor season when you hear this message. So if you are a fan of the Star Wars television show Andor, and how could you not be, because it's the best Star Wars thing that's been created in a very long time, and I will be doing I think week-to-week breakdowns, which basically means covering a Star Wars movie every week for 4 weeks, and no, for 3 weeks, but it's 4. No, it's 4. It's 4 weeks. 4. Yeah. And so that is happening over on the feed for Rebel Base Card podcast, Rebel Base Card. It's primarily a trading card podcast, but I come on and do show recaps with the host over there, who's also named Greg. So would love to hear or see some of you over there if that's appealing to you. And if not, then fine. Don't come. It's only for cool people. Is it? I don't know. We'll see next time through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.